We can start. So good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Noélanie Menet, and I work at the AXA Research Fund. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this conference on building resilient cities that was organized with Marie Destremo from AXA Group Corporate Responsibility and the Property and Casualty Insurance team at AXA. So we hope that you will enjoy the conference, the workshop, and all the networking opportunities of today. And so to start the day, it's my pleasure to welcome on stage Jade Harris, Group Head of Public Affairs and Corporate Responsibility of the AXA Group, also overseeing the AXA Research Fund, and member of our scientific board. Jade, I leave you the floor.
Thank you, Noélanie. Yes, it's a great pleasure for me to be here this morning and to welcome you for this event. Let me start maybe by telling you a few words about the AXA Research Fund. Noélanie mentioned I am in charge within the AXA Group of Public Affairs and Corporate Responsibility, and actually the AXA Research Fund is the one most important initiative that we have in terms of corporate responsibility. So let me elaborate a little bit on this. As you know, we are an insurance company. As an insurance company, our mission is to protect people, is to help them out when they go through trouble, either because they have a car accident and they're sitting on the sideway waiting for some help, or because they have a health problem, or because their house got flooded. And we are here to support them and to help them to rebuild their lives after an event that can be dramatic, very dramatic, or not so dramatic. And then we gave a thought to this, and roughly 10 years ago, we decided that, of course, it was very important to stand by our customers, whether companies or individuals, and help them out when they are going through rough times. But it would be even better if we were able to prevent those risks that are affecting them sometimes severely. And as a consequence, we launched the AXA Research Fund to support research in the areas of risk in general. So we fund research on health, we fund research on climate, natural catastrophes, we fund research on data, cyber risks, and we fund research on economics and socio-economics, I would say. We have committed 250 million euros, which is a lot of money for the AXA Research Fund. And I am proud to say that today, after 10 years of existence, the AXA Research Fund has funded more than 500 research projects, many of them being chairs that we fund in leading universities in the world. 500 projects in more than 30 countries, and out of the 250 million euros, we have already committed 170 on those 500 research projects. So this is to AXA a very important initiative because we believe we contribute through this fund to a better world and to help people lead healthier and safer lives. Over time, we've matured with the AXA Research Fund, and we thought that it was a good thing to fund research, but it would be even better to support researchers in communicating their research to the general public. We think it makes sense to also lead the world towards a better state, to have this research available. And so we've started to organize this type of events. We call them matchmaking conferences, and we bring together researchers, some of whom we support, some of whom we do not necessarily support, but they're leading experts in their areas, with practitioners, AXA experts, AXA customers and clients, and there are a number of them in this room, and I would like to greet them, so that we can have fruitful exchanges between the academic world and, I would say, the real world. if I may say so, to the academics, so at least the worlds of practitioners. And so this year, this is actually the fourth event that we have on this. We had one less than a month ago on critical illnesses throughout the world. We had another one 2 months ago on cybersecurity and protecting data. And we strongly believe that we contribute to a better world through these events. So in this context, I would like to thank all of you, and I would like to thank particularly the speakers of today. Professor Deborah Bell, who came from New York to be with us, who comes from City University of New York, and who is an AXA Research Fund grantee. Thank you for being there. I would like to thank, I'm sorry, I need the help of my paper. I rehearsed, but Joe Dose from South Africa. You are, Joe, the Deputy Chief Resilience Officer of Durban. And I have to say that through this role, I discovered that large cities had resilience officers. I wasn't aware of that, so I learned something. Thank you for flying over all the way from South Africa. We have Esteban Leon from UN Habitat, working also on resilience. So thank you, Esteban, for being here. And we are privileged to have also Robert Gunzig with us from the National Geographic, who will be leading the panel later today. So thank you to all of you. Why did we think it's important to have an event on resilient cities? Well, you know that, number one, the world population is growing. It's growing fast. Today we have 7.5 billion inhabitants in the world, and there will be 9 billion by 2050. But more importantly, the percentage of this population who is working, who is living in urban areas is increasing dramatically. In 1980, less than 50% of the population was living in urban areas, 40%. Today, more than 50%, actually 54% of the world population is living in urban areas. And in 2050, 70%, so more than 2/3 of the population, will be living in urban areas. So these are massive numbers. I don't want to overburden you with figures, but I think this gives an indication of what is happening here. Every week, every single week, 1.5 million people are moving towards urban areas. And so in a country, in India, by 2050, there will be 400 million more people than today living in urban areas. In China, 300 million. In Nigeria, 250 million. I was, in my previous role, before leading public affairs and corporate responsibility, I was responsible for our businesses through the so-called MEA region, Middle East and Africa. And one of the countries where we have presence is precisely Nigeria. Well, I can tell you, when you go on the way from the Lagos airport to the center of the city, where our AXA offices is, first of all, it takes you roughly 3 hours. One way, and you can see the challenges of dealing with such a growing population, with a population that is moving towards the big city like Lagos so fast, and all the difficulties raises going through these endless suburbs which are very poor. So yes, there are major challenges, and because the cities are growing beyond their, I would say, natural geographies, now you have more and more people settling down in more dangerous areas, particularly in terms of flooding and being close to coasts. And so this raises challenge. So building resilient cities and helping cities to cope with potential natural catastrophes is a major challenge. And so we thought we could, through such an event, contribute to address these issues. As an insurer, how do we believe we can make a difference? Well, we believe we can make a difference in 3 ways. By empowering our customers, whether they are individuals or companies, to deal with these issues, to mitigate the risks of a major natural catastrophe in the cities. We can also encourage public authorities to address these issues and support them in doing so. We have a very fruitful partnership with UN Habitat in this areas, trying to design with them building codes that can establish standards that cities can implement when they build or rebuild after a natural catastrophes. And we can foster strong public-private partnerships between those two worlds that do not always communicate well, the public sector and the private sector. So this is what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you again for being here. I wish you a very fruitful event, fruitful discussions, and I now hand it over to Philippe Derieux, who is the Deputy CEO of AXA PNC, who will say a few words. Thank you, Philippe.
Good morning, everybody. Since Jade has said a lot, I can be very short now. So I'm very glad to share this city resilient workshop, if I may say so, with you, because it's very close to my heart. It's, in my mind, one of the major challenges we have to face as a society, the human society. I don't say AXA, I just say the human society facing the future. And it's so important. Jade has given some figures. I will give just one or two more, which are just about natural catastrophes impacting the built areas in the world. You have more than, on average now, expected 300 billion cost each year. So, wow, billion US dollars, I'm sorry. 15 of the biggest cities in the world are located in earthquake zones. Think about Mexico City, Istanbul, and many others. So we know that there is a huge challenge for us as insurers, of course, because we are, of course, protecting the citizens of those cities, the companies working on those cities, and we need to move on. That's why we have made efforts to go, to move, to do more, to better understand what will happen or what is happening already. And to this respect, we have, and Jade mentioned that, we have a certain number of things to treat. The first one, and that's not something you don't know already, you know that, is, I would say, the awareness of people, the awareness of companies. And when I walk in the street in many cities, from Reykjavik to Johannesburg, or from Santiago in Chile to Jakarta, and you just open your eyes, listen, breathe the air from time to time, not very good. You see there's an issue. And you see that people do not yet very much care. Some who have been very much impacted, of course, are afraid already because they know, but not all the people. So the first thing is, how can we really have an impact all together? And when I say all together, I mean, we say us, insurers, plus some other industries, partners, like my friend of Suez, and also the public sector, all together make the public people, I mean, the people understand better what they are facing. And it really starts with the awareness. The second point, of course, is understanding better what will happen or what does happen today, which is about risk analysis and which is about modeling. And that's an everlasting issue because that's something we've got to work out every day because things are changing, of course. So it's extremely important also for us, this risk analysis, capacity to understand what happens and what could happen in the near future. The third point is reacting and acting. So that can be some things like building alerts for the people in case of storms, floods, or whatever. That can be also working on post-crisis management, which is something we have discussed a lot with our friends of UN Habitat, because that's not only, trying to prevent and to mitigate, as Jad mentioned, he used the word mitigate, which is very important, but also to make all the post-crisis analysis and help at this stage. So all this value chain is not possible if we do not work together, and specifically with the research fund of AXA, and that means with researchers and the external research in close coordination with the public sector. We need the help of the researcher to better understand what will happen, what happens. We are in a world when, I say that very often, we were in a world which was somewhat complicated. Today, that's a complex world and very difficult. I have an obsession on cities beyond the natural catastrophe, which is my cup of tea, which is all the connection between the different things. What happens? What are the consequences? The chain. What will happen if ever something happens? What are all the consequences? And go down the chain. Very difficult now, today, to assess that, to understand. If I would say, an electricity supply stopped there, what will happen as a consequence in all the city? And that's our goal all together. And I'm very proud and always very happy, and my teams have always been very happy to work with the research world, because we need you to help to understand better and to bring this back to the society, back to, for us as insurer, to our customers, but on a wider scope, to the society. So this is why we are here today. That's why we try to exchange, to move, to understand better, to try to connect better all together, because, and that will be my last word, if we want to capture more data, not a fashion, not a word big data for a fashion, that's not a fashion, that's a mean to be better. If we want to do that, we need to break the silos and work together much closer, which is the essential for the future of this city resilience topic, which is really close to my heart. Thank you very much.
And so for the next presentation, it is our pleasure to have and to welcome Rob Kunzing, Senior Environmental Editor at National Geographic. So National Geographic has been our partner for about 3 years now to share the science we support for the benefit of all. And Rob will talk to us about cities and sustainabilities and how do we face these challenges. So, Rob, thank you.
Thank you, Nolani. I'm here to show pictures, so I'm going to stay out of the way. I'm delighted to be here in my favorite city in the world, talking about how to build resilience in cities. There's a lot to talk about. There's no question that cities are going to be facing some major challenges in the coming century. This is the biggest dust storm in living memory hitting Phoenix, Arizona, a city that is already, to an Easterner anyway, unbearably hot and is going to get perhaps unlivably hot this century, and yet it's the fastest growing city in the United States. Phoenix boosters will tell you that that's because people from the east have to flee rising seas, and that's why they're going to keep growing. This is the New Jersey shore after Hurricane Sandy hit in 2012. This year, it was the American Gulf Coast that got hammered by a series of hurricanes. This is Harvey flooding Houston, but Houston had been flooded in 2015 and 2016 as well by 500-year storms. And that's because extreme rains are becoming more common all over the planet. This is unfortunate man trying to escape a parking garage in Chengdu, China. And of course, as we heard, these extreme events have ripple effects on urban systems. And after Sandy, a lot of the power grid went dark in Manhattan. Looking at pictures like this, you might say that the best thing we could do would be to move everybody out of the cities as soon as we can, but that would be missing the big picture, I'd say, of how we as a species are going to survive on this planet. At National Geographic, we've made a concerted effort to raise public awareness on these issues over the past decade and to wrap our arms around this daunting challenge. And over the next few minutes, I'm just going to give you a quick taste of some of that coverage, and I hope to leave you with a a license to feel at least cautiously optimistic even in these troubling times. And to do that, I want to start in the 18th century. Sustainability is what I'm mostly talking about here, and that has become such a buzzword these days that I don't know if you've ever wondered where the idea even came from. Was it some green person like Nicolas Hulot or Rachel Carson who invented it? No, actually it was a man in a suit of armor and a big wig who was more of a tree cutter really than what we in America call tree huggers, or what people call environmentalists like me. Hans Karl von Carlowitz was the superintendent of mines for the Duke of Saxony in eastern Germany. And silver mines were a big deal for the Duke of Saxony. They were the source of his wealth, but to smelt the silver, Carlowitz needed a lot of wood to make charcoal. And the problem was, at that time, Europe was facing a wood crisis. Most of the forests had been cut down. So Carlowitz basically came up with a simple principle: cut no more than you grow. I mean, he'd actually learned a little bit at the hand of Colbert in France on a tour here, and it is a simple principle, but it's basically the same principle that the Brundtland Commission would formulate 250 years later as the sort of general definition of sustainability. It's simple for a family or a forest, but what does it mean on the scale of a planet? We've been debating that for half a century, ever since this gloomy little book came out in 1972, The Limits to Growth. And it suggested then that we would be running out of key resources by 2100 and that we'd be facing civilizational collapse. And in fact, that is still a possibility. And yet, when you consider how we got to this point, it's my contention that the road ahead doesn't look quite so dark and forbidding. If you go back to Carlowitz, his recipe for sustainability wasn't just cut fewer trees. It was also burn something else. He suggested peat. But a few decades later, in his part of Germany, people discovered a better solution. It was coal. It was coal that saved the forests of Europe. And it was coal that fueled the Industrial Revolution that raised all our living standards so dramatically. This is an example, a general principle. Over the last few centuries, it's happened again and again. Each time some limit has come along that cuts off progress, we found a way to walk through it. Today, of course, we've hit the wall with coal. This is a coal mine in eastern Germany near where Carlowitz lived that photographer Luca Locatelli and I visited a few years ago. The machinery is amazing, but our challenge today is to find a way to close down amazing places like this and fuel our economies more in a cleaner way. Luca and I were working on an article for a special issue that the magazine devoted to climate change in 2015, right before the Paris conference. Climate really is the biggest challenge, and here's one way to understand that. You've all seen those pictures that say that we're using more than one Earth already. We're using 1.5 Earth worth of resources. Well, what those people are saying when they say that really is that even if we covered all of Earth in trees, there wouldn't be enough to pull all the carbon back out of the air. So our carbon emissions are the biggest part of our footprint. And naturally, for an American especially, it's frustrating these days to be still debating as the ice melts and as the sea level rises whether we really have a problem instead of how to fix it. This is Svalbard in Norway, which is a global warming, one of the fastest warming places on Earth. And I wrote these words in 2015, right before the Paris conference. The American political landscape was obviously very different than it is today, and yet I still think it's true. 2015 was a turning point. Getting 195 countries to agree in Paris was a landmark, and even though the US is wavering for now on its climate commitment, other countries like China and India are charging ahead. And even Germany is having great trouble closing those lignite mines, but they did pioneer, as an industrial country, the push to renewable energy and helped make it cheaper for us all. Renewable energy has become so cheap now that it seems likely that in this century the world will convert to it. And the big question is, are we going to convert to it fast enough to avoid a climate disaster? The climate problem exacerbates the next big problem, which is that of feeding a population that's headed for, as Jad said, toward 9 billion by 2050. Today, according to the FAO, there are 800 million hungry people in the world, and that's obviously way too many. This is a family in Nairobi. And yet, there are actually 200 million fewer hungry people today than there were a quarter century ago. And that's in spite of there being 2 billion more people on the planet. This is a map of food supply that's available per capita, and basically the warm colors are bad and the blue colors are good. The pale blue is about 2,600 calories per day, which is sort of what the human needs. And this is what it looked like in 2009. It's just been a huge increase in food production. Today, in some parts of the world, like Texas, the problem is an overabundance of food rather than a shortage. And yet, by 2050, there are going to be 2 billion more of us. And already we're farming or ranching 40% of the planet in some places of Brazil. All that's left of the rainforest are the valuable Brazil nut trees. So it's another hard wall we're facing, and it's especially hard the challenge is that we need to increase food production dramatically and yet leave room for something we care very much about at National Geographic, which is the wildlife of the planet. My wife asked me, why are you showing this crazy picture? And it's just because it's one of my favorite pictures ever at National Geographic. It's a black rhino being airlifted to a safe haven in South Africa, actually. There's no simple answer, obviously, to the food challenge, but the low-hanging fruit is food waste. We waste about 1/3 of the food we farm, and so there's a huge opportunity there. But it also seems clear that we're going to have to intensify agriculture even more, apply more energy and technology to it, and start to think also hard about what it really means to be sustainable. This is a cattle feedlot in Texas that I actually spent a week on for an article on beef. It isn't pretty, but it's very efficient, and in some key ways, like carbon emissions, it's more sustainable than fattening cattle the pretty way on grass. Some people would say, of course, that the problem is there are just too many of us already, beef eaters or otherwise. Our population has soared from 1 billion in 1800 to more than 7 today, and who knows where it's headed this century, but over 9 billion for certain. People have been saying for a long time that we were hitting a catastrophe. In 1800, Malthus said it was imminent. The Reverend Thomas Malthus said it was imminent. In 1968, the Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich said something similar. Both of them said that soon famine and disease were going to decimate the human population. But each time, some new idea came along to avoid the catastrophe, whether it was the chemical fertilizers in Malthus's time or the smallpox vaccine, later the Green Revolution. And so the population didn't fall, it kept growing. But before we blame everything on human population, it's important to remember why it has grown so fast. Basically, it has grown so fast because we saved a lot of little children in the developing world from dying by giving them access to healthcare, sanitation, and agriculture. So would we do it differently if we had the choice? I would say not. We don't really know what population is going to be in 2100. The UN projects 11 billion now, but other demographers say that's a big overestimate. And the problem is it's not a problem in physics, it's a problem in predicting human behavior, and that's notoriously hard. The key determinant will be how fast birth rates come down in Africa, where they're still very high. What we do know is something about how to bring birth rates down. Making contraception, the key thing we can do is to help Africa to modernize, and making contraception widely available is obviously one part of that. But even more important is just general economic development and education, especially for girls. And finally, urbanization, because it's an empirical fact that when people move to cities, they have fewer children. As Jad said, in 2050, there's a massive urbanization going on right now. 2/3 of humanity is going to live in cities. It all began here in Europe and then in America in the 19th century. And early urban planners spent a lot of time fighting it. They considered urban growth to be the problem that they had to stop. This is London today, but in the 1880s, the chairman of the London City Council described his own city as a cancer that was sucking the life and the blood, and this is a direct quote just about, sucking the life and the blood out of the surrounding countryside. Dhaka in Bangladesh faces huge challenges today, has slums comparable to the ones in London of the last century. But there are two things to remember about urbanization. The first is we can't stop it. People move to cities because that's where the money is, because subsistence agriculture is hard and mechanization comes and eliminates farm jobs. And the second thing is we shouldn't want to stop it, because cities ultimately are not the problem, they're the solution. I don't mean to minimize the challenges that these developing cities face. I'm just saying that if the growth can be managed well, then it'll be the fact of urbanization will make the planet better for us all, because cities use less land per capita, people in cities use less energy and emit less CO2, and as I said before, they have lower birth rates. And they leave more room for the other creatures of the planet. Earlier this year, I got a chance to visit a city that would seem to contradict a lot of what I just told you about how great cities are. Dubai, a booming city on the Arabian Gulf. We ourselves at National Geographic have used Dubai as a kind of poster child for unsustainability and for the huge footprint that man exerts on the planet. It is, after all, a place where you can go skiing inside a shopping mall when it's 45 degrees Celsius outside. It's a place that grew from this is the creek, to this in just a few decades. This is a view from the world's tallest building, the Burj Khalifa. And this is supposed to be an animation, yes, showing you how fast Dubai has grown along the coast. Dubai did essentially everything wrong. That is, it grew just like American cities grew, only faster. It became a sprawling city in the desert, a city of glass boxes designed for cars. And yet, even in Dubai, there's a hopeful trend lately. It's a new mindset that's come in, not coincidentally, with the financial crisis of 2008. Basically, environmental sustainability has come to look like an economic good thing to the leadership of Dubai. This giant industrial plant is where modern Dubai gets almost all its power and water. It's called Jebel Ali, and natural gas is burned here to make electricity and at the same time desalinate seawater. And here's the thing about the gas. It's almost all imported. It comes from Qatar and Bahrain, and even occasionally in tankers from the United States. Dubai is utterly dependent on gas imports, which is not very comfortable. One utility official did this when he tried to explain to me what it felt like for a whole society to be dependent, not just for its electricity, but for its very drinking water on imported fuel. So when solar energy prices, thanks in part to that German energy boom and to the Chinese boom, fell below 3 cents a kilowatt, building one of the world's largest solar plants in the desert started to look like a very reasonable idea in Dubai. There's a lot of empty, hot, sunny desert. And even before that, the idea of building a driverless metro seemed reasonable when traffic was stopped on their 12-lane main artery that goes along the coast there, Sheikh Zayed Highway. They built it in 5 years. And it now carries as much traffic as the road. And developers are starting to build places like this. It's called the Sustainable City. It's a it's a new development that makes more energy from solar panels on the roof and above the car parks than it consumes, and that saves 40% of its energy just by positioning the buildings in such a way that they shade each other from the heat, from the sun. Not everything is complicated about sustainability, and visiting Dubai reminded me of this other bedrock principle. We as environmentalists do ourselves no favors if we make ourselves into the moral police who are condemning others as sinners, who are telling my fellow Americans to drop their cheeseburgers and step away from the SUV. Or by telling Emiratis they can't take their little kids skiing in the desert. I stood in line with some of those little kids at the lift, and I can tell you it's kind of fun. If they can do it with solar power so that they're not putting in carbon in the atmosphere that's making all of our climate hotter, more power to them. As I finished this talk, I started to worry that I was going to sound a bit like Voltaire's idiot, Pangloss, so let me just emphasize that I don't think this is the best of all possible worlds. We have to make it a whole lot better, but the point is we're not going to do that if we yield to despair. And the reason I've wanted to remind you of how far we've come is because it's so hard to imagine now in 2017 all the things that are going to happen so that by 2100 the ice sheets aren't melting and the rainforest hasn't all been burned down. In a way, it's easier to imagine the catastrophe than it is to imagine all the things that have to happen to avoid it. And so for many people, catastrophe comes to seem inevitable. But the thing is, we don't have to be able to see the whole path ahead. We don't have to be able to see all the little changes. And I'd like to leave you with this quote, one of my favorite quotes from an American novelist, E.L. Doctorow. He was talking about how he writes a novel. He doesn't start the novel knowing the whole plot ahead. But it seems to me that what he says here applies to life in general, and especially to living sustainably. We don't have to know the whole road ahead. We just need the courage to get started and then to keep going. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. Very interesting presentation with beautiful imagery, which is also one of the power of National Geographic. So for the next presentation, I welcome Deborah Bell. So Professor Deborah Bell is from the University of New York, and she received an AXA grant for her work on estimating city growth and their exposure to risk, notably climate change.
Thank you, Noelani. Thank you for having me. And I'm happy to follow Rob, but I should tell you in advance that I'm glad he gave you many beautiful images because I'm going to give you far less. We're going to get under the hood, so it's going to look a lot more mechanical and a lot less. There's beauty in it, but a beauty of a different sort. I was asked to speak about understanding city growth and urban populations at risk, which is a good thing because this is what I spend my days on when I'm not teaching. So let me tell you, I'm going to tell you what we know as a group of academics and much of my work on what we know and don't know, who's at risk, where are the people at risk, and what are the connections between these risks. And then lastly, I'm going to end with a little bit of technical stuff on understanding projections, forecasts into the future, and understanding future risks under conditions of huge uncertainty, which dovetails nicely on the E.L. Doctorow quote, which is, we don't need to see the end of the road, we just need to be able to see a little bit in front of us. And I think that is definitely true in the current century. We are faced with huge uncertainties now, and so we need to put in an evidence base that will help us reduce that uncertainty, but also becoming more comfortable with uncertainty will be an important part of the 21st century. Let me tell you some demographic truths. We've heard a little about this already from Jad and from Rob, which is the future world is irreversibly urban. The bulk of future population growth will take place in the cities and towns, not of the entire world, but really the cities and towns of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and even mostly Asia and Africa. And the future world is increasingly aging. I'm not going to talk about this, but this is definitely relevant. There are far greater proportions of old persons. That's a population pyramid. Some of you, I'm assuming the actuarial side of the house, is familiar with this construct. That is China. It's women are shown in pink there. That's 5-year age groups. Men are shown in blue, and that's roughly the current period. And this is what it will look like in 40 years from now, with far more people in the older ages. And this definitely has implications, both population growth, city growth, more people living in cities, and older populations. That doesn't mean that a lot of countries will still be very, very young at the same time, so we'll have these two dual forces, lots of young people and increasing number of elderly, perhaps without the support systems for those elderly. And I would say that these all have implications for climate change. Today's urbanization is different than in the past. We see this high bar here. These are the more developed countries of the world. This is 1950. This is 10 years from now approximately. And these are cities of different sizes. The largest bars are cities of 1 million to 5 million, and the darkest bars are 10 million or more. And what we see here is truly unprecedented, that in the more developed countries of the world here, we see these huge numbers of large cities. That is truly unprecedented from anything that we experienced in the past. We also see an unprecedented number of of small cities. So while a quarter of the cities are, so we see these very large cities, but a quarter of the cities are very, very small, meaning cities less than 500,000. That's what you see in the light blue. These are our giant cities. Roughly 12% of the cities, but twice as many are in small cities. And you might note that no place smaller than 100,000 persons is here. And of course, there are many urban places, maybe not cities, but towns and places on the satellite cities that are in that category. They aren't even part of the record keeping. So how can we expect to understand the full range of city growth without understanding these smaller places? They may be in particular statistical offices of particular countries, but as a global entity, we don't know about places that are smaller than 100,000 persons that have otherwise urban characteristics. So they're missing from this pie. Climate change, just to say a few words about it, because that helps us understand who's at risk, we can expect wide-ranging changes. Sea level rise, flooding, which I'll talk more about in a minute, drought, increasing temperatures, more anomalous weather events, and so forth. Let me just focus, since I don't have all that much time, on flooding expectations. We can expect permanent inundation of low-lying areas. We can expect increased flood heights for something like New York City. The current 100-year flood height is about 3 meters, and that's expected to increase to close to 4 meters by mid-century. And since I first wrote this, those estimates I know are currently being revised, actually. They believe that might actually, thanks to Hurricane Sandy and or Superstorm Sandy and other recent weather events, that is being revised upward, I believe. Also, we can expect more frequent flooding. The 100-year flood return period is expected to be reduced to as low as a 19-year flood return period by mid-century, and by the end of the century, perhaps, or not even the end, by 2080, to be a 4-year return period. So that means something on the scale of major flooding every 4 years. So sometimes we think, oh, people just don't remember the last time there was a bad flood. Places will get, a place like New York City is at risk of getting a major flood event by the end of the century once every 4 years. People will remember that. And as we saw this year, we can expect more intense tropical cyclones. So we saw the Norway coast there, the Norwegian Arctic, and there are some climate unknowns, particularly the science is a little unclear on ice sheets, the degree of warming, and broad regions, yes, we know where changes are going to occur, but we don't know in particular where they will occur. And because cities occupy small physical footprints, this is particularly important. Every time there's a major storm that hits the east coast of the United States and there are major evacuations, or in the case of Florida, in the most recent hurricane cycle after Houston was so badly hit, South Florida was evacuated and people were, half of the people were happy and the other half were like, I can't believe I left. It wasn't as bad as it was supposed to be. And so the idea of even short-term forecasts not being accurate enough, in fact, there were really bad storms. They just didn't hit the coast of Florida as badly. They hit other places. Puerto Rico was not, Puerto Rico was devastated by this storm, for example. So, and other Caribbean islands. So we don't know precisely where, and our science for getting precisely where is still quite new. Let me tell you some basic gaps in our knowledge about urbanization. We don't know where that growth will occur. Forecasts of city growth are currently non-spatial. We don't use spatial methods to think about how cities will grow. We do not know whether they will grow on the periphery of cities, on their outskirts, or in new cities. We don't know if they will grow vertically. This is a huge gap. We don't know if much of that growth will be in poorer areas or to poor people or in slums. We don't know the causes of city growth. This may sound silly. Well, we know a little, but we don't know as much as we should. We don't know for the most part if it's caused by natural increase or migration. We don't know about and by natural increase, it's, fertility minus mortality. We don't know about the composition of city growth, particularly the poor, but also the age balance. And we don't know precisely where those climate change impacts will occur. Who's at risk of hazards related to those climate changes? So I would argue the key to understanding cities in the future are that the traditional demographic data, primarily censuses and surveys, which is what we've used, or vital registration, they're not sufficient to get at this problem because they're not collected in containers that are amenable to this kind of information. And they're not, traditional demographic methods are aspatial and they're oriented toward national units. But with all the future growth of the world taking place largely in cities, I would argue that they're ill-equipped to think about that. So you might think, oh, well, how about use satellite data? Well, satellite data, which I am going to talk about at the end, they're neither, and other spatial data are great and we should embrace them, but that's using the data from a completely different community, and alone they are also inadequate. So these things have to be used together. And I would argue they need to be used together systematically so that you can place in context, create demographically informed estimates of city growth in a spatial context, which will allow us to come up with estimates of populations at risk and even some kind of spatial forecasts of city growth. This is the result of that approach. I'm not really getting super under the hood, but imagine a series of very, very fine census units with some other ecological information on flooding hazards. I use this acronym right here, the LECZ, which is the Low Elevation Coastal Zone. That's roughly 10 meters contiguous to seacoast. This is a study that we did about 10 years ago. And in fact, when we did it at the time, it was criticized for people saying 10 meters, sea level is not going to rise up to 10 meters. But then we had some major storms right after that, and many, many cities of the world use a 5-meter emergency management scenario. And in fact, those they have been revised also upwards that, okay, maybe we'll see sea levels rise. And of course, we do see storm surges at that height. So estimates of this, I will show you estimates of populations at risk of seaward hazards associated with climate change. We see this pie is divided into different continents. And we see globally more than this is circa year 2000, 600 million persons, 1 out of every 10, lives in this low elevation coastal zone, and roughly 466 million persons in Asia. Importantly, roughly 1 out of every 8 city dweller does. So people who live in cities are more likely to live at risk of these seaward hazards than people living outside of cities. And again, deeply in Asia, we see 240 million Asians living in this zone. Now, remember, I said that population is growing in the cities and towns of Asia and Africa, so Asia really comes out prominently as a place we need to care about. This reveals some important patterns and complexities about cities of the more than 180 countries with population in this low elevation coastal zone. 70% have their largest urban area extending into this zone, and more urban people in those cities than urban land. So people are disproportionately putting themselves at risk. And exposure is not uniform. In Vietnam, a country where we have really good data, we see that roughly where we have good poverty estimates in the census, of roughly 2.8 million urban dwellers who live below the poverty line, 2 million of them live in the coastal zones of coastal cities, and that's what this figure shows, that the dark blue bar are the people who live in coastal zones of coastal cities. The other poor are living pretty much equally in the non-coastal land of coastal cities, the safer areas, or in non-coastal cities altogether. So can this approach that we can use to describe the current time period be used to predict city growth? This is India, and it shows the current cities of India overlaid with aridity zones and that low elevation coastal zone that I just told you about. And at the bottom here, we have a statistical model for growth. And just to share the mechanics of it with you, this is a term for fertility, where we want to know at the city scale, we want to understand the growth is determined by fertility, mortality, migration, and then some other terms, like maybe you might think that large cities, because they're already large, grow more slowly, so something like city size, or the concept that is used to collect cities, or even the ecological units. Maybe coastal cities grow more slowly than inland cities, and this is something that we can determine with this kind of modeling. However, we have to retrofit existing data. In particular, none of these data are collected for city units, so we have to use subnational data or national level data for urban fractions and retrofit it into this approach. And accounting for internal migration is particularly hard for reasons that we can talk about in the panel if you want, but national level migration statistics are pretty easy to understand. Internal migration statistics to cities is really one of the weak links of census data keeping. And the spatial extents of urban areas come from new satellite time series, and these are untested in forecasting applications. So for those of you in the room who do work in the forecasting or actuarial side, you know that for everything that you predict, for everything you want to predict in the future, you have to be able to predict it in time sequence. So you need something on which to do that prediction. So just in the last year, we have the archive of Landsat data has been reprocessed by a group that's based in Ispra, Italy, the joint part of the European Commission, and they have created this layer. I'll show you a little bit in a minute that will allow us to get at the spatial extents of city globally and consistently. But importantly, none of this modeling effort takes into account feedback from the climate change. So let's say we expect that cities are going to be transformed, coastal cities are going to be transformed, for example. We don't have a new coastline to predict. We can't predict coastline changes, for example. And most demographic forecasting, even though we can do it at the global level, as we've seen already, we can do up to 2050 and 2100. We can't do that for cities. We don't have the uncertainty becomes too great. So we did an approach to 2050 just to look at water shortages using this approach, and this is what we see. The estimates are actually at the city level, but this just is summarized for a nice map to show us that we can expect the places that will experience greater water shortage. This is not access to water, it's simply water availability. And this is in a paper that appeared about 5 years ago. We find that in fact water shortages will be very, very great in parts of the Middle East and India and even China. So we see and that these will and these are urban water shortages. And again, this is where the city growth will be occurring. One of the important things is that in predicting future water shortages through 2050, we expect it to be determined by the demographic changes. And then it's only after that do we expect climate change to kick in and be the cause of water shortages. So this is not, so there's a lot from a policy perspective that we can do that's not related to climate even. Some of our best actions toward future climate remain in the demographic sphere. So understanding city-specific and metro area population changes. Oh, before I go on, I should just mention that in the context of this, that growth model that we showed shows that fertility is a main driver of city growth. So we talk about cities as if they're growing exclusively because new migrants are coming to them. And yes, new migrants are coming to cities all the time. Some of those migrants are coming because there's higher fertility and not so much employment opportunities. and their climate change is certainly leading to lost livelihoods in rural areas. But some of city growth, in fact, a large part of city growth, even though people choose to have, once people live in cities, they have lower fertility, cities still have quite a bit of momentum to them, and much of city growth occurs intrinsically because of fertility. So not that we should, so at least as Rob mentioned, contraception should be made available to people who have a desire for it in cities. This is a simple policy opportunity that is often lost in the message of first going after the climate. There are some really basic infrastructures in place that can be taken advantage of. Let me just show you a little bit about city-specific and metro area population change. I'm going to show you South Florida in the U.S., 3 decades of block level change in spatial formats, and then Mumbai, India, a decade. And use those satellite data that I previously mentioned, and it measures built-up land consistently from 1975 to 2015. And then I'll show you again that low elevation coastal zone hazard, for which we only have a single time point, given the satellite from which that was derived was passed in year 2000, and it has not subsequently been, has not been an update. So if we want to look at changes to the coastline and changes to elevation, which are occurring in coastal areas more than elsewhere, we think of elevation as a fixed effect, but it's not fixed when we care about coastlines. That data set was a one-time only data set. So this is what I'm referring to in the next images. This is the east coast of Florida. This is the west coast. This is where Miami is roughly, and we see that total population change. So Miami is a place that has huge flooding problems, and that's the blue line there. So that's like the whole the whole east coast of Florida. It has grown much faster than the U.S. population has. The west coast of Florida has grown more slowly, but it has also grown. This is what the built-up area. So these are a satellite data that represents not urbanization per se, but the built-up signature for this part of Florida. If it's red, it's 80% or more built up. The gray shades are fractions, quartiles below that. This is 1990. This is 2000. That's 2014. And that's the low elevation coastal zone for this area. So this growth is all occurring in areas that are very, very flood prone on both the East Coast and the West Coast. Then similarly, we can look at places that have census blocks. This is another way of looking at it, where you can see places that have remained urban. And these are the places that have transitioned from rural to urban. You can notice they're on the periphery, they're further from the coast, but they're still at risk. And in Florida, some of that inland area is extremely ecologically frail. A lot of it's protected. This is from Mumbai. We can do the same approach in Mumbai. And here we see this is population. If it's the darkest hue there, those are a population density of 5,000 persons. 5,000 the population is 5,000 per square kilometer. So pretty dense by just about every standard. Even the next one is equally dense. This shows up to 1 meter, 3 meters, 5 meters, and 7 meters of coastal hazards, 10. And then finally, we can look at, again, the built-up area. This was 1975. That's 80%. That red hue is 80% or more built up. The other colors are, again, the lower. That's overlying the low elevation coastal zone. That's year 2000, and that's the coastal zone. So we can use this approach to see which areas are growing, where are buildings at risk, and where are people at risk. And they clearly are within these zones. So having these images don't give us, they do tell us along the lines that Rob was showing. There's Malthus, there's Ehrlich, and there's this woman named Esther Bosrup who very famously pointed out that technology will always allow us to live at a higher, within higher population levels than you might otherwise think, and otherwise build seawalls and other technologies. So we have places like Miami, for which you would think nobody on the whole east coast of Florida, or New Orleans, and many cities. Lagos is another great example where we've had a lot of people living in close proximity to seaward hazards. And cities are disproportionately at risk, but they're going to continue to grow, it looks like. Large cities do grow more slowly than small cities, but seaward hazards do not keep people from moving to cities. Overwhelmingly, the future population growth will occur in the cities and towns of Asia, Africa, Latin America. Today's methods do a good job of describing current population trends, but we still need a lot of work required to understand future population and urban places at risk. There is a pretty good understanding of the OECD countries, but a pretty poor understanding of the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world. The connections between these risks, like the feedbacks between population and climate models, are pretty much unknown. It would be a disservice to say we know much. We can guess, but we really don't have a solid understanding. And even downscaled climate models are not suited for city-scale adaptation plans. And this is important because we do need to sort of work closely with the climate community to better understand ways that these models can be downscaled and used at a city and regional scale. And lastly, I'd like to acknowledge the AXA Research Fund and others. And this is just to point out here, this is Paris. And you don't need to be a coastal city to experience floods. I didn't have time to go into that, but in fact, not only is flooding cities are really at risk of increasing aridity, and inland flooding is another, and storms affect cities throughout the world. You don't have to be coastal. It's just coastal cities are the poster child for, and of course, historically, most cities are located on rivers, and that puts most cities currently and will put them in the future at risk of flooding, whether from weather events or from ice melts or all sorts of things. So thank you.
So thank you, Deborah, for presenting us with tools and issues that can help cities and public policy makers. So now I am welcoming Esteban Leon from UN Habitat, with which AXA has a partnership on promoting compliance to building codes to build back better after disaster. Esteban is the Chief Technical Advisor for the City Resilience Profiling Program, so he will tell us a bit more about how cities fit into the Sustainable Agenda development and a bit more about city resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, I guess. I mean, what's worse than presenting after National Geographic and after a professor? I think they did it on purpose, no? In addition, I'm not a native English speaker, so I will have to pull out my best Oxford accent, inexistent, and present. I have, well, I'm not a researcher, I'm not an academic, I'm the kind of person who learns by hitting his head against the wall many times. and I'm here to present a global picture, I would say. I have like 100 slides that I'm not going to present. I think it's better to go through the history and evolution. When I was on the table, Rob asked me, how did we arrive to this city resilience profiling program? Let me start from the beginning. UN Habitat is the program of the United Nations that is dealing with human settlements. So as you could see in the previous presentations, our mandate, the mandate of working with cities and human settlements, it's growing daily. Yet, UN Habitat is one of the smallest agencies in the system. So that already presents you one challenge. I think we have to, as an international system, agree that we have to start thinking more about the future and less about the past. The program started, well, I started in 2001 when we used to work quite a lot in what was called the disaster management program. The disaster management program was more on risk reduction, on disaster response. In 2004, we started working on what's climate change, adaptation, and then we have the tsunami. At the end of 2004, we had the tsunami hitting the world. After that, we have the Pakistan earthquake, and after that, we have a series of events. So we switch from that mentality of trying to work on adaptation and climate change to running after the disasters. And my same agency started this program on humanitarian response. And we embarked into that phase of the international system of working in emergencies, responding, relief, and all that. But then we soon realized that we could work on that for the rest of our lives. And when I'm saying lives, it's in general, I mean the whole society, because it's not going to stop unless we stop and we start preventing, and we start doing some risk reduction, and we start doing some resilience building. And that's why I think the topic of today is perfect for my program. I'm very selfish on that. The program is called the City Resilience Profiling Program. So what better than this venue? And the idea was, I've been in most of them. I've been in the tsunami-affected countries. I've been in Pakistan, Afghanistan, in Haiti earthquake, in Peru earthquake, in El Salvador flooding, Philippines hurricanes, last year in Ecuador during the earthquake in the coastal areas. And the reality is that we are not prepared. We are not ready to respond to these emergencies. These emergencies are happening more and more, and the international system is not ready for that. We are simply not ready for that. We cannot go running after the emergency because we are not enough and our capacity is not enough. So then we decided to switch, and we decided to start thinking on how do we build resilience in cities? How do we make sure that the cities prepare? And I will attempt to define resilience, since somebody in the table also asked, I mean, is somebody going to define resilience? I hope it's not a poor attempt of defining resilience. I will say, for us, urban resilience is the capacity of the urban system to respond, to react, to recover of any shock or stress. That's our main concept. Not only react, respond, and recover, but also keep functionality, keep the city working and after any shock or stress. And we think about shocks as externalities and stresses as internalities. So basically, when you have a city working daily and you have a shock, the city will react. It could react positively or it could react negatively. Hopefully, if you are well prepared, you can react in a positive way and you can keep functionality of systems. I like the analogy of a city or an urban system as a human body. So what we do basically is we analyze the human body or the urban system. The lungs, the heart, the stomach, the brain, and we want to have a healthy human body or a healthy city, urban system. And then we start injecting to that urban system some challenges. So we inject an earthquake, we inject a flooding situation, and we see how that human body or urban system reacts. In the case of a human body, it will be, I don't know, malaria or tuberculosis. You inject and see how it reacts the body. In a city, will be an earthquake, will be a flooding situation, will be a conflict, and you see how it reacts the urban system. And this is the attempt that we try to do. We analyze systems in a city. We have a methodology in which we can start collecting some data and information, and based on that data and information, take some decisions. I fully agree with Philippe in his introduction, where he was saying that data is important when it's useful, when it's a means to an end, and we took that approach. I was in Colombia once, in Bogota. I'm not from Colombia, by the way, but I was in Colombia, in Bogota, advising the municipality there, and they asked me, "Can you help us with our city? You know, I mean, how do we start working on some planning?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And I said, "What was your main problem?" And what the response was, "We have data, yes, but we have too much, and we don't know which one is relevant, which one is useful for us to take a decision." And I think that was a very honest response from them. They said, "Well, you know, we can get data for everything. We have data and information, but we don't know which one is relevant." And in fact, when they show me, they have so much. They have collected so much with not clear kind of thinking. And that was also part of our idea. Okay, let's try to create a methodology where we can collect some data and information that is relevant for the municipality and the rest of the stakeholders to take action, to build resilience. And that's the program. I don't know, I must be in many slides already gone. This is the first part what I say. This is our Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. And it's interesting what he says, that humanitarian response alone is not sufficient, that we should establish solid links between humanitarian resilience and development dimensions. It's very important coming especially from him, because he was the High Commissioner for Refugees for many years. So he was a core humanitarian actor, and you know, it's a very strong message, because it's exactly what I was saying at the beginning. I think we have to stop running after disasters and start preventing disasters and building resilience. This is our program. I know my presentation looks like a 5-year-old presentation after the National Geographic. So, but anyway, I will do it anyway. So yes, we estimate 75% of the world's population by 2050 will live in urban areas. That's something that is predicted, and I think it will happen. We should be ready for that. Climate change is not the only one, but it's one and the main challenges that we are going to be facing in the future. We have to know that engagement with stakeholders is highly important, and that's the important part in this venue, I think. You know, we don't have enough. Usually the UN system is an intergovernmental organization, so we work with governments, national authorities. But we have to agree that, you know, the society in general is the one who's going to build resilience, not only the authorities, it's the people, it's private sector, it's all the stakeholders, and that's an important point to take. And then, yeah, we go through local governments and build together with the municipality, because they have most of the data for services. So this is my attempt of defining urban resilience: to absorb, recover, adapt, and sustain. This is the way that we are working. I will pass some of this very fast, because I have, as I said, I don't know how many slides. You know, everybody was adding some slides, and this is important. And I'm a simple guy. I prefer to have just a couple. The program, what we have is we have a part which is technical cooperation with cities, which really much we get inserted into the local authorities, into the municipality. We work with all the systems, with the electrical system, gas system, water systems, the mobility person, and we build together what are the best scenarios for the city. We have a very, very big pillar on advocacy, because we still want to advocate for building resilience, and we want to advocate for all the nations and local authorities and people to know that that's important. And we have a part of knowledge, which is research, and we try to keep, we try to do our best to keep on top of that as well. But I want to show you, well, this is, the process is data collection. We collect data, we see the quality of the data, we assess, we do the data processing, we do the diagnostic, and then we have some outputs. The whole methodology is divided in two main parts. One is the CRPT, the City Resilience Profiling Tool, and the other is the Actions for Resilience. The City Resilience Profiling Tool is 4 sets of data and information. The first one is the city ID, basically an ID of the city, as if it was an ID of the person. Information, general information, what the city location, population, and all that. The second set is the stakeholders. We do a mapping of who are the relevant stakeholders in the city. So electrical companies, water companies, telephone companies, all what makes a city to function. The third set is the hazards and the impacts, which means that we collect data on what type of hazards they may have in the city. As I was saying, in a case of a person, it would be, I don't know, malaria or yellow fever. In the case of a city, could be it's exposed to earthquakes or to flooding situations and to all that. And the fourth set, which for me is the most important one, is the city elements. And that's where we do the MRI or the X-ray of the city. We go into the systems and we identify if the city is healthy or not so healthy. For the first one, we have the location, population. Here you have some of the data that we collect, and we are able to present that of any city, for any city. And we say, okay, this is the ID of the city of Paris, for example, of the city of Maputo, or the city of Asunción in Paraguay, or the city of, Port Vila in Vanuatu. This is quite easy to get. We can get it quite a lot by doing some research in the internet, and we get some information available quite fast. The second set is the stakeholders, local governments and stakeholders. There we do a mapping of all the stakeholders, and we have major institutions, government entities, private sector, civil society, and we collect all that to see who's the one who takes decision in a city and can influence decision as well. The set 3 is the hazards, and there we divided into social, complex, natural, environmental, technological, biological. So then you have a broad picture of what hazards you can confront in a city. And the fourth one, which is the one that I said to you, for me is the most important, is the MRI, the X-ray of the city, where we go to basic infrastructure, built environment, economy, environment, public services, social mobility, and all the systems. I don't know if I'm going too fast or too slow. As a good Latin American as well, I can talk for hours, so somebody will have to raise hand and say, okay, stop. So what we do is we collect that. This is the way that we are collecting at this moment. And then we have this modeling. This is very important because this will show you that there is an interconnection among everything. You cannot talk about water system without thinking about electricity systems, and without thinking about communications, and without thinking about roads and access, and And this we learn in the hard way. I remember arriving to Haiti after the earthquake in 2010, and we were all very well prepared, apparently. But when we arrived there, we didn't have roads. Everything collapsed. So the maps, the simple maps, didn't work. We couldn't find the names of the streets. Access was an issue. So it didn't matter how much relief items we had, tents or water or cookies. If you cannot distribute, it's a problem. I have something similar happening in Georgia after the Russian invasion in 2008. Where we arrived and they said, well, okay, this is the first event that we have, and it's in a city. How do we react to that? Before the international community, it was very used to go set a camp. You put all the displaced population into a camp, and you provide relief items in that camp. So it's more or less easy. But in a city, when you have people dispersed and all the displaced population are going to different buildings, you cannot identify who's displaced for the event and who's been always living there. As an anecdote, I will tell you that we did a research and in Haiti, and we identified that one of the camps, I'm not going to mention the camp, but in one of the camps that was created after the earthquake in 2010, 80% of the population living in that camp was not part of the earthquake of the city of Port-au-Prince. They came from the rural areas to the camp because it was easier to go to the camp, get some food, get some shelter, get some water, rather than staying at the rural areas where it's very difficult to live. That shows you that it's something that we should think about. Perhaps, it's not the type of response that will benefit us entirely. But anyway, that's another anecdote. I can give you many stories about that. So the idea of the modeling is that everything is interconnected, and we have to analyze the systems, and we have to make sure that the systems behave, and we have to know that what will impact what. And then basically after that, what we have is the actions for resilience, which is basically passing recommendations for action to the government. We started calling it first resilience action plans, and we decided that we shouldn't call it resilience action plans because a plan is more a kind of legalistic part. 3 minutes. But what we can do is recommend what to do to the mayor, to the local authority, or to the national authority, and they can think about it and they can prepare. The good thing with this is that it's evidence-based, it's objective, it's technical, and in a way it's also provides also some kind of document for accountability. I mean, which is very important. I have well, this is the process. We do the initiation, we do the formal engagement with the city, we do the diagnosis, we do the actions for resilience, and then we take this further into how do we react, how do we act with that. I think I will pass these slides. We have a large communications and advocacy, but this is important because I don't want to come here and present only a program. What is important here is that we are trying to also coordinate these efforts. We have the Medellin Collaboration on Rural Resilience, which is a collaboration among large organizations working on resilience. Medellin Collaboration is not a cartel, it's a collaboration. It's Medellin Collaboration because we had a World Urban Forum in Medellin in 2004, and we launched the initiative in Medellin. And part of this initiative, we have 10 members. One is Rockefeller Foundation, Resilient Cities 100, Climate Change C40, ICLEI, the World Bank, GFDRR World Bank Group, Inter-American Development Bank, UNISDR, the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, Cities Alliance, and I'm forgetting the last one, which is us, UN Habitat. 10. So these 10 organizations, we got together and we say, okay, let's try to coordinate and organize ourselves. Where are you working? What cities are you working on? And we can start doing what's called the city tracker. And what we have is this mapping of cities where we are working together. So then we avoid duplication and we maximize resources and we try to cause an impact. Then we also have the Global Alliance for Urban Crisis, which is trying to merge the humanitarian relief community with the developmental community. And then we also have, of course, the Humanitarian Intelligence Standing Committee. I think we have 1 more minute. So this is very important. I mean, the previous one, I was. Because the collaboration among these large organizations makes sure that we can have a coherent and, you know, and larger impact. But we are also in this program trying to address the 4 major large agreements. The SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, we cannot forget about that because, you know, we have some goals to achieve by 2030, especially goal 11, which is sustainable cities, resilient cities, safe cities. So the goal 11 is something that we all committed as countries and as persons to deliver. The other large agreement is the Paris Declaration for Climate Change. That's very important. We have to start doing something because otherwise we will be, as you can see, we will be in trouble. The third agreement is the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is also very important because we all committed as well to this. And the last one was launched last year by my own agency, which was the New Urban Agenda, which is a recognition that we have to do something to build resilience in cities. We have to start changing trends, and we have to start supporting by urban planning, by urban financing, by urban governance, legal, national legislations, and impact on the ground. I think these are the main points that we all committed as countries. Everybody has a nationality here, and your own governments committed to these agreements. And this is what we are trying to achieve. And by this program, we are trying to do that. We're trying to facilitate, capacitate, because definitely with all the trends that we have seen in the previous presentations, local authorities, national authorities, and cities don't have the capacity to absorb all this migration, all these people. And we saw it. I mean, if you go to any city, you will see that most of the vulnerable parts of a city are the parts where you have poor people because they arrive and they basically land or set in unsafe areas because are the cheapest or, you know, in a city. And that cannot happen because as long as we keep doing that, as long as we, we keep putting people at risk, we are going to be running after emergencies. And that's something I wouldn't like to do anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Esteban. I guess it's a challenge bringing together all stakeholders. So the subject of this conference is building resilient cities. Difficult to miss that. And we could not talk about cities without having around the table. So it's my pleasure to welcome Joanne Doos from Durban. And Joanne is a Deputy Chief Resilience Officer of Durban.
Well, good morning, everyone. And my job this morning is really to take a lot of what's been said this morning and to bring it down into the perspective of a practitioner. I also have to acknowledge that as well as being the Deputy Chief Resilience Officer, which sounds probably a lot more important than it is, I'm also a local government official. So hopefully I bring the voice of government into the room. And really what I want to share with you today is a perspective from a local government that's really grappling with many of the issues that have been spoken about this morning. But before I go into the detail, just for those of you who don't know anything about Durban, I thought maybe I should quickly paint a picture. Durban it's a big city in South Africa. It's a large municipal area, a population of about 3.7 million. But what's important, I think, to point out in the context of resilience is that it's a city that faces high levels of poverty, high levels of inequality, significant backlogs in terms of service delivery, in terms of infrastructure provision, particularly for the poor. But on top of that, we have what I consider as an environmentalist a huge asset in Durban, which is our natural environment. And so we've got a very interesting city where we have an urban core, which looks much like the pictures we've seen this morning, but a really vast rural hinterland, which has forests, grasslands, which plays a core part in how the city functions and how we think about resilience. So Durban's been part of an international program, and Esteban mentioned it, 100 Resilient Cities. And as part of that program, the city has been provided with support to really grapple with this concept of resilience and what resilience means. And I'm glad there was one definition of resilience. This is kind of building on it. We really started that process of saying, well, what does resilience mean? And came to our own slightly varied, a slight variance on the previous definition, around resilience being about a city's ability to respond to a world of change. So whether we see social change, economic change, environmental change, we need to be, as cities, understanding what do we need to do in order to strengthen ourselves to respond to that, and what do we need to fundamentally change. And I think that second part is important. Sometimes we sit with systems that are not effective anymore, and so what do we have to change? It's been a long process for us being part of this particular program. We've been participating for about the last 3 years. We've tried as far as possible to engage our stakeholders in Durban around what resilience means and where the city should be investing as priority areas of action. But at the same time, we've tried to keep our eye on the international game, on what's coming out of UN Habitat, the new urban agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, and obviously more recently the Paris Agreement around the climate change agreements. And have tried to take on board not only local perspectives on what resilience is, but also the global messaging that we see coming through. We've been through a long process, and I'm not going to share all the detail with you, but essentially I think Esteban gave me a nice intro, because essentially a lot of what he spoke about was the process that Durban has gone through in trying to identify where our resilience challenges lie. I like the use of the word of the use of the analogy of an MRI, and understanding the system, understanding the city system, and trying to grapple with what the core resilience challenges are that are facing the city. What are those things that stop us from being able to be in a position to respond to the changes that we see coming? And through that process, we landed on 6 what we called levers for change to build resilience in Durban. And I'm going to share those with you this morning. The first is really around strengthening local communities and building social cohesion, which obviously is particularly relevant in the context of South Africa. But what a lot of our stakeholders said is that unless you have social cohesion, you can't be responsive to change, unless you have functional societies. They also highlighted for us the need to improve the effectiveness of education and skills development. And education is a national crisis in South Africa at the moment. But what I think this was picking up on was also the need to make sure that the skills we're developing in our young people match the needs of the economy, and that we retain those both in our city and in our country. In Durban, we see a huge flood of skilled people out of the city. And if we're going to be a city that's responsive to all these complex changes and challenges that we see, we have to retain them in our city. Thirdly, that we need to manage our environmental assets more effectively. And what often is not spoken about, many of the developing cities of the world still have incredible natural assets. And so it's really important as cities that still have those to be thinking about how we use them in the context of resilience. Our natural environment provides us with a huge number of services: climate regulation, water provision, flood attenuation. And so how do we really build our natural assets into the heart of how we see our cities and how we build resilience? The fourth lever that our stakeholders identified for us was around promoting economic growth in line with 21st century trends and opportunities. And a big message in this lever was around, particularly in Durban with its very high levels of inequality, was really trying to make sure that the way in which we grow our economy is inclusive, that we not only look at the opportunities for big business, but that we look at the opportunities for small business growth, for the informal economy, but also that we keep our eye on what's happening internationally. And so, for example, if we look at what's happening in the climate change debate, we need to make sure that cities like ours and cities like yours are responding appropriately, that we're looking to alter our economies, to move them away from economies that are intensely carbon dependent. And Durban's not thinking about that at the moment, and that's a challenge. The fifth lever was around creating a more inclusive and integrated spatial plan. So again, linked to our, obviously, South Africa's apartheid history, we have a history of segregation, of pushing people outside of cities, of moving them away from opportunity. And that reflects spatially still, even many, many years after the birth of our democracy. And so what our stakeholders and the people of Durban were saying is we've got to improve that situation. We've got to make sure that we plan our cities better to connect people where they work, with transport and opportunities for jobs. And that plays out very spatially in the city. And the sixth lever was around improving municipal effectiveness. I'm a local government official, and in Durban, the local government plays quite a strong role in how the city is run, but not always a very effective role. We don't partner well. We have systems that constrain innovation, that make moving and transitioning and being innovative very difficult. And so how do we move past that if we're going to be a city that is responsive to change, that's able to be flexible and adaptive? So these 6 things were big systemic challenges that the city faces in terms of its resilience and in terms of whether it can respond to the changes that we see coming in the future. And when we as a team leading this process looked at these 6 things, we said, well, we know these are the right things. We know these 6 things are absolutely critical. They're kind of the underlying pieces that if you got all of this right, we would be on a great track. But the problem is they're not that practical to implement. And we really wanted our resilience strategy, which is the end point of this process, to really focus on things that we could rally people around, that we could get energy behind. And so we went back to our stakeholders and we said, well, these are great. We know these are important things, these 6 levers. But where in the city do these 6 things spatially manifest most strongly? In other words, where are the places where these things come together to create really acute risk for the city? And through that process and that conversation landed on 2 very unexpected, but I think very important areas of work that the city is now trying to rally its efforts around. And the first was around our informal settlements and how we rally and work more collaboratively in that space. And I'll talk a bit more about that. And the second, and this might be quite foreign to many of you, but was really looking at how we better integrate the governance systems that operate in the city of Durban. We have a municipal governance system that operates probably much like that in Paris, which is based on formal systems of governance, our traditional town planning processes and so on. But out in our rural areas, we have a traditional governance system that operates with kings, with chiefs, with people who manage and allocate land under traditional customs. And one of the big challenges in Durban is that those 2 systems don't speak to each other. And so just to talk a little bit more around informal settlements, this really, in many ways, although not only due to our apartheid legacy, we see this trend happening in cities all over the world, people moving into cities to access economic opportunity. Currently, and for me this is a frightening statistic, it's probably worse in many other cities, but 23% of our city's population currently live in informal settlements. So these are shacks. These are structures that are cobbled together to provide people with shelter. They are areas where socio-economic conditions are incredibly poor. There are often few services, a lack of infrastructure, and that creates huge risk for the city. It creates huge risk for the people living in those settlements who are subjected to those conditions, but it also creates broader risk for the city. Some of the NGOs that we've engaged with have highlighted that this issue for Durban is literally a ticking time bomb socially and economically, and creates a lot of environmental risk as well. The second issue around governance is also incredibly important in Durban. Our traditional governance system operates in almost 40% of the land of the municipal area. And because these two systems of governance don't speak to each other, the municipal governance system has very little control over how development happens in those rural areas. And we're seeing incredible growth happening there, often unplanned and in areas that are not appropriate. That is a huge risk for the city. Some of our key environmental assets, our key water supply catchments lie in these traditional governance areas. And so the challenge is, how do you pull these together? It's not to say that one is right and the other is wrong, but how do we better integrate to plan our city more effectively? And so some of the ideas that, and I'm happy to share the resilience strategy with anyone who's interested, but just to really summarize some of the ideas, what is contained in our resilience strategy, which essentially has these two issues at its core, is around acknowledging informality as a key part of our city and not seeing it as something to brush under the carpet, but to elevate it as a strategic priority, because that is a huge percentage of our population that are living in those conditions at risk. To look as a local government, and this is really, really difficult, at how we balance this very facilitatory approach of saying we acknowledge that informality is part of our city, with a management and regulation role, which is essentially the role of local government. And how do you balance that? How do we build partnerships for implementation? How do we partner with NGOs and CBOs better, and community members themselves, to look at new forms of governance that can be a bit more innovative in this space? Importantly, how do we think about climate change in the context of informal settlements, which are often the most vulnerable to impacts of flooding and to a whole range of related challenges? And how do we, and this issue of data has come up very strongly this morning, how do we look at the data that we have about people, their movements into cities? Why are they there? Why are they in these settlements? What do they need in order to better inform the kinds of decisions that we make in these spaces? Around the second issue of governance, what is really challenging to us in this space is it's essentially asking us to come up with a new governance system as a city that pulls these things, these two governance systems together in a better way. Because if we don't do something, we're going to lose huge parts of our city, which creates incredible risk. But also that in doing that we are more participatory in how we plan spatially as a city and involve people in that process. These two issues, just ironically where we landed, are probably two of the most politically contested spaces in Durban and South Africa. And so these are not easy issues to deal with, but we feel they are important starting points. I must emphasize that they are starting points. So what I'm not saying is that these are the only resilience challenges that Durban faces, but essentially that they're an attempt to draw down from these big systemic challenges into very specific spaces where we feel we can bring people together, where we can have a focus for action and really put on our training wheels and figure out what it means to do things differently in these two spaces. And so just a couple of reflections. I think what this experience, and I'm an environmentalist, I never expected to be dealing with informal settlements or issues of governance. But what this experience has taught us is that resilience will, and our understandings of resilience will vary, city by city, country to country. And it's really important that as cities we grapple with what it means in our context. It also, I think, and where we've landed in Durban, raises really important questions around who are we building resilience for? In a country like South Africa, which has such high levels of inequality, of poverty, our resilience efforts have to be directed at those who are poor, at those who are often marginalized, at issues that are often a little bit swept under the carpet. I think for me, captured in this resilience strategy of Durban is really elevating inequality and issues of our natural environment and governance. Also acknowledging that our cities are building themselves, particularly in the developing world, in ways that we can't control. So we can try to stop it, it's not going to happen. And so what that means is we need to be thinking differently about what a city is, about what urbanism means and how we respond to that. And also that how we think about the modes of governance within resilience is also important. So in one way, it's great that we've landed on 2 areas of focus to start our work, but the how of resilience is also important. So how we build partnerships, how we coordinate action, how we understand the political context in which we work, which often can constrain or facilitate action, and how we build partnerships. And I think some of those things, the sort of softer side of what we do, is really important in mobilizing action. And importantly, that we retain a level of strategic focus when we're thinking about resilience. So Durban has chosen 2 starting points, rightly or wrongly, but there's a focus. And we really think that in the huge sea of challenges that cities like Durban face, which can be really, really overwhelming, that having a level of focus is important in order to be able to rally people around very specific actions in order to drive learning and advance our cities. And so just to leave you with a quote, which I've taken from our resilience strategy, is building urban resilience will require a new mindset and a willingness to rethink the identity, in our case, of the African city. It also suggests that as we increase resilience in some systems, that we might need to reduce the resilience of old systems that limit change and innovation. So really thinking about what are the things we have to strengthen, but acknowledging that many parts of our city actually have to fundamentally change. And I think that is the challenge for us as we now embark on trying to implement our strategy, is really being challenged to think quite differently and to start grappling, particularly with the systems that need to fundamentally change if we are to build a resilient Durban. Thanks.
Thank you. So we can start the panel discussion now. I need you to mic. So the topic of this discussion is systemic risk, what is at stake for cities, and cross-sector collaboration. So the panel will be facilitated by Rob Cousin from National Geographic, and our panelists are our speaker from earlier. So Philippe Derieux, Head of New Keynesian Business Model at AXA Global PLC, Deborah Bell from the City University of New York and AXA Research Fund Fellow, Johan Touz from the City of Durban, and Esteban Leon from UN Habitat. So panelists, I give you the floor and the mics.
Okay. Noelani suggested that we start by defining systemic risk, and it's a big mistake to ask a journalist to say anything specific about anything. So the way I try to bring it home, I think we all have an intuitive sense of what systemic risk is. If you lose your job or if you get sick, you might also lose your house, and who knows, maybe you might lose your life too. It's all connected, isn't it? And, as with individuals, I think a big part of resilience in cities is how psychologists have discovered in studying resilient individuals that what characterizes them is how they frame their situation. They frame their situation as something they can do something about. And I think some of that must also be true about cities. If we want to build resilient cities, we have to start with the idea that it's within our capacity to do so. And I must admit, listening to some of the speakers after me, as my native optimism started to shake a bit. And so I wanted to start maybe with Deborah, and I was really impressed with those slides of Miami. And Miami is, to any American, is sort of a big conundrum. Why are people still moving to Miami? And what is that doing to that city's systemic risk? Can you explain that?
Well, I'll talk about Miami in general terms, since it's like many other cities. Coastal cities have, people like to live near coasts. Societies like to have access to goods and services which historically have been, located near waterways. And so there's a lot of momentum behind particular places. And once, cities are cultural entities as much as they are a series of, a collection of sectors, for example. And so people like Miami, and people like the place, and it's, look at New Orleans for another example. New Orleans floods repeatedly, and each time people move away, some people move back, new people move to New Orleans. I mean, there's coast of Dhaka, Bangladesh, and people, this is the capital city. New Orleans is not the capital of the U.S., but you know, you have.
But it's French and it's beautiful. So
right,
there's a reason.
right, and it might have been the capital of, 150 years ago or something of, the French colonial part of the southern United States. Anyway, the point is that people that in places like Miami, there is a lot of, despite the current political climate in the state of Florida, which is a climate denialist state, the Miami's, the municipality of Miami-Dade is very much pro-climate intervention. So there are a lot of adaptation plans in place. Roads are being lifted. Seawalls of some types are being put in place. Now, Miami is actually not a great place for a seawall. It's actually, New York City is a much better place for a seawall. Nobody in the U.S. talks about seawalls the way that they talk about them in the Netherlands, for example. So, so seawalls are not really an option, but people, I don't have the answer to your question. I have speculations. People, the return period in which these events occur is maybe not long enough for people to think that they are, that they're really at true risk. The other thing is there is a marketplace for mediating those risks. And so maybe there's, I know that after Superstorm Sandy in New York, there were 2 or 3 localities within New York City, one on Staten Island, another in Brooklyn, that were deemed uninsurable. So the insurance market, both the federal underwriting as well as the private insurance market, no longer will insure those places. And so I think that sort of market response is an important part of the overarching strategies. So, and it's not simple enough to just be a, we can move some people, but moving people is hard. People like where they're from. People like the individual choice of being able to live where they want to live. So it has to happen over a planned horizon. And I think it would be naive of us to expect that mass movement is the main response to climate vulnerabilities. That resistance will take resilience will take many forms, and a lot of that will happen in places that are very, very, prone to climate hazards in the near term and in the farther term. So.
Well, Philippe, what about that? Let me put you on the spot. I want you to talk about how the insurance industry sees systemic risk, but can the insurance industry stop? Why isn't the insurance industry in America stopped Miami from growing so much?
There's such a big accumulation of risk that it's not insurable anymore, because you put the insurance industry at risk, they can collapse themselves, the industry. So, and it's also heavily regulated, so the regulator, of course, comes and say, well, stop that. But, and there's something, that's a type of a paradox too, that if you say to people that whatever happens, you are insured, people won't take care and won't take any measure to protect themselves. I've seen recently some risk manager of a large company telling me they had a big loss, and they said, well, we don't care. And I said, well, what measure are you going to take now after the loss? They said, well, we don't care, we are insured at a low cost, so why should I care? So that's a pure economic calculation, but very short-term view. And so there's a mixture between what we call, fighting the moral hazard. That means people who say, well, I'm insured, I don't care. And the fact also to say, well, we still have a role to play. And then let's work on the risk mitigation. Let's work on the prevention. Let's work a lot. That's why I said that in my previous speech, that today in the value chain in the insurance industry, we start with risk analysis, then prevention and mitigation, and then come to insurance as such, and then to crisis management. That's a full value chain. That's not one part, just acting as pure insurance. I give you an insurance policy and I will play you a game. That's over. The game is over. So that's where we are today, and I'm glad to hear that in some part of New York, and I remember about Sandy, because that was really helpful, that the insurance industry say, well, we don't do it. If you don't act, we don't do anything more. And also, in the US, the national flood system, whatever, is close to being bankruptcy.
It interferes with the market a little bit.
So we need to invest something where we include in all the process all the resilience in the sense that we try to mitigate and take the measures. And also in some cases, that's not always easy, as you mentioned, and prevent people to still build a new house close to the seashore. We need some courage to do that, or in France also close to the river shore, not maybe the seashore, but also the rivers. Say, well, no, sorry guys, don't increase the risk anymore. Very difficult.
Yeah. Joe, maybe you could, I was struck in your presentation when you talked about the informal settlements, that they're 23%, I think, of the population in Durban, and you said that they are a risk to themselves, but also they create a systemic risk for the city. Tell us a little bit more about that. How exactly do they create a risk for the whole city?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there are a number of ways. I think for me, one of the biggest is inequality. So there's a lot of research that's been done that suggests that in unequal cities where you have these huge differences between the very poor and the very wealthy, it's not good for anyone. So your cities generally just are worse off. And so at a very sort of broad level, I think that this sort of very exaggerated levels of inequality are a big risk. At a more practical level, to give you an example, what we see happening in some of our informal settlements creates huge risk for the infrastructure of the city. So as an example, theft or illegal connections, because people are desperate. They want access to electricity, they want access to water. In some cases, they're putting in place illegal connections, stealing wire to try and sell for a small amount of money. We've seen in Durban whole bridges collapsing because of theft. We've seen electricity supply literally cut off because of very small incidences of that nature. And so I think we can't underestimate the fact that if we don't start to look at these issues and really build opportunities for people who are living in those spaces, the broader city is at risk. Obviously environmentally, so in many informal settlements, for example, processes to deal with sewage, to deal with water runoff are not adequate. And so massive pollution of our rivers, both with sewage pollution but also waste pollution. Litter pollution, which clogs up our rivers, which damages our estuaries, our beaches, which is a massive source of tourism for the city of Durban. So it kind of, for me, it spreads across that range from this broader sense of you just don't want inequality in your city. You really need to be bridging that to these very practical things around infrastructure, around environment, and the very real risk of social uprising in these spaces. People are increasingly desperate to access opportunity to improve their lives and are beginning to resort to means that are reflecting that desperation, and that's not good for anyone in the city.
Yeah. And Esteban, I think you mentioned that's how you ended your talk, also saying that cities just don't have the capacity to absorb all the people who are coming, and yet they will come. And so one of the reasons we need to focus more. You talked about how you had sort of a change of heart in the mid-2000s about how you needed to start focusing on resilience, and otherwise we keep running after emergency. Can you tell us any more? Was there a place where you've had such amazing experiences being in all these disaster areas? Was there a time or place where that really became clear to you that just responding to disasters wasn't going to be enough?
Well, in many places.
Yeah.
In many places you start thinking that it's not only the inequality that is not fair, but it's also that, one thing that I like to say is that perhaps the most resilient people in this earth are the people from Haiti. Going out from the city but going into an individual, you can see that I saw it, that after the earthquake, these people were already trying to recover themselves. They were already trying to sell stuff in the streets. They were, already reactivating their own lives. And for me, that's a kind of hope, that you see that people are reacting, that you should treat them as assets, not as liabilities. That in any society, people want to go out. I mean, that's the reason why our species is still here. No? Because we keep fighting, and we keep recovering, and we keep, and that's, I've been put in a positive note. That's the part that I think that we have to build on in our societies, in trusting people and knowing that they are going to do their best to recover from whatever event they have. And that's what I remember I like to think in some of the occasions. You know, I was in places where I was thinking, it doesn't matter what we do, this won't change. But reality is that it can change, and that people are doing the, from the international system, I must say, I don't know, I think that 30% of the, or even less, 20% of the efforts are actually on recovery and reconstruction. Most of the efforts are from the local people. The first line of response is at the local level. You can see it immediately. When you arrive to a place like that, you see that they are already mobilizing and they are already working on that. The only thing that we should make sure is that we support those efforts rather than duplicate or come and take. And I think that was one of the problems we also had there. You know, it's, I have plenty of anecdotes and stories of discussing with mayors or
How about one? I'm wondering if they're, so that you mentioned the Haitians and individually they were inspiring after that disaster. Are there, in all your travels, are there cities you've been to that sort of point the way forward, that you think are starting to do a better job about creating resilience on a governmental level, or are there any examples like that to help us picture what it's like to be prepared?
Well, I think that the Philippines, it was a good case, where, very quickly they started removing rubble, they started, because that was one of the challenges.
After the typhoon.
Yes, yeah. In most of the responses, the challenge is who's going to start cleaning up, removing rubble, opening spaces, access, and all that. We don't have a specific organization doing that kind of job. But the people themselves, they start cleaning, and I think that was very. The comparison was quite strong from different countries to countries. You have some that are much more action-oriented and some others that are more passive. In their own way, they try to solve that problem, but it's quite interesting. It has been an interesting journey, let's say.
I should say we're going to have time in just a few minutes for a couple of questions from the audience, so we can start thinking of what you might want to ask. Joe, back to you on the problem you described, which was not familiar to me, the idea of having two sort of parallel forms of governance that have to be negotiated. That seems to sort of double or quadruple the problem of creating a resilient city. I was wondering, if you could do one sort of concrete thing now, what sort of concrete change could you imagine making in Durban that would make it a little bit better, a little bit more resilient? Not something about dialogue, but something about changing the way the city is built, or what are you all? What sort of next step are you hoping on as you try to move towards a more resilient city?
Are you talking generally, or are you talking about the governance? You're talking more generally?
I'm floundering in the abstractions of resilience. I'm looking for something like, well, we're going to create urban farms, or we're going to create a way of making the city more. You said you had giant floods just recently. Maybe it's we can do something a little to make it more flood resistant.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So, maybe to give a couple of examples, just to pick up firstly where you started the question, which was around this issue of governance and bringing the two systems together, which is a very immediate crisis for the city. I think a first step, if we take the politics of the issue out, which is difficult, but for a moment, I think one of the very practical first steps is actually collaborative planning, actually developing spatial plans together, those two governance systems coming together to spatially plan certain areas. To pick up on your the question around flooding, Durban recently had severe floods about a month ago, and our current climate change projections are that's likely to increase. So many more dry periods, but also much more frequent flooding, which obviously puts our informal settlement communities particularly at risk. Often they are located in areas that are highly vulnerable. But some of the things that we're trying to do in that space, which for me brings together and brings the environment picture also into the story, is, for example, looking at our ecological infrastructure, so looking at our natural environment and how that better supports our built infrastructure. So when you look at something like a massive flood, the first thing that pulls the city to its knees is when roads are washed away, when houses are washing down rivers. And so a big challenge for the city is how to use our natural environment better to try to reduce that risk. And so one of the programs that we're trying to roll out in the city is a program that looks very specifically at our river systems as a key part of the city's infrastructure. Because if our rivers are not functioning properly and are clogged with litter and clogged with rubbish, they block up systems, they block up stormwater systems, they exacerbate the impacts of flooding, they exacerbate damage to roads, to other infrastructure. And so one of the programs that has been running for a couple of years, in which we're working actually with C40 to try and upscale in the city, is how do we bring communities into those spaces, working to keep those rivers clear, to remove invasive alien plants, to keep our natural environment functioning. Because if we don't do that, all the sort of systemic risk that flows from that in terms of exacerbated impacts, in terms of clogged stormwater systems, exaggerated flooding, just becomes a lot bigger. And I think we've got to be innovative about those kinds of solutions. So how do we also draw people in, create job opportunities through that? And so at a very practical level, those are some of the kinds of efforts that the city's trying to look at to minimize flooding risk, but also to look at our natural environment and to improve human well-being at the same time.
And did you find that the recent floods, did they create a sort of teachable moment where there was an opportunity for improving the dialogue with your partners in governance?
Yeah, I mean, someone the other day said you have to maximize the value of a disaster, and I think it's a horrible thing to say, but yes, it is an opportunity to raise levels of awareness. I think it's an important opportunity to say this is actually the new future. You have to imagine this scenario happening a lot more often, and sometimes it's quite hard when we talk about things like climate change to imagine what that future is like, and it's helpful, it's not great to have it, but it is helpful when incidences of flooding happen, is to use that as a moment to say this is the new normal, this is what we have to be prepared for in future. It gives people something more practical that they can lock into. So yes, it does become a moment to increase awareness, to raise the bar in terms of what we're doing, and just understanding what that will mean for the city going forward.
I just want to add to Joe's comment. I think that water resources are perhaps the example of one of the most, the sector for which there is the least cooperation between different parts of the municipality, as opposed to something like urban transportation, where if a rapid rail line were to be expanded into the nearby regions that are developing, there would be very clear cooperation. But the water images, the water shortage, urban water shortages, that led to a subsequent collection of data on water resources at the municipality level and at the supra-urban level, or these urban agglomeration level. And it's clear that even within cities, like a large city, New York City is an example, gets its water, perhaps like Durban, from much farther away. And New York City knows where its water is coming from, but many, many towns and parts of suburban New York get their water from other places along the way. There is a connection between the natural resources and the use of rivers, for example, and as well as surface water and groundwater. There are many, many, and then there's the closely coupled relationship with sewage treatment, another infrastructure that cities deeply depend on. And the level of cooperation and even knowledge sharing on this domain is, I would say, one of the weakest that we have, and as I said, in contrast to the basic population changes that are occurring in cities. The basic infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure is kind of like a model sector that works pretty well together, but water is highly contentious, I believe. And an example where governance, and not even at the level of governance, even at the level of information collaboration is in many, many places more absent. I would say, globally speaking, it's more absent than it is present.
Mm-hmm. So do cities I was talking about how cities are such a great thing, but if the goal is to give our 9 billion or 11 billion people healthy water, does having them in cities make it easier or harder? Joe, do you have an answer? I keep asking unanswerable questions, I'm sorry.
I think that, there will be a response. Cities will respond to, but my guess is that there will be deeply unequal responses to it. Much of many African cities, like the arrangement for water resources, drinkable water resources, come in more forms than you would recognize at all in a place like Paris, for example. I mean, where people get their water delivered by a truck that brings water to, home delivery of water, meaning it transfer water as opposed to satchels, which is another option. So there are, I would say and it's kind of an interesting marketplace, you could think of it, but it's all a marketplace that has arisen out of market failure from local governments. So I think there will be adaptation to that prospect, but yes, it will be a challenge.
Philippe, we're supposed to move towards a view of the resilient city of the future. Where do we want to be in 10, 50 years? Does AXA have a sort of a guiding image of what a resilient city would look like? Or?
Well, we might have a dream first.
Dreams are okay.
The guidance is difficult to set today, but actively participating to the action with our colleagues and all the people around here is very important for us as insurers, and as also, people who try to participate in the improvement of the society, so that beyond the pure insurance work, and whatever, we won't survive if we don't do that for the reason you mentioned about the Brooklyn and the fact that it's not insurable at all anymore. So let's have a more proactive view, bringing what we know, because we know, for many reasons, of course, we are modeling all the natural catastrophes and try to get more and more granular data, very precise data on the fields with very detail to 1 meter detail for anything, for a flood, for example, how it expands, having the type of maps which are dynamic maps saying, well, day 1 or at 11 p.m. it's there, at 2 a.m. that's there, and see and how it flows and how it goes back to the river is something we are already working on. And beyond that, working on complex systems, express the different and the connection between the systems, things like that, and that's what the UN Habitat is trying to do too. So connecting all that is our core business too. So this is the way, on very pragmatic standpoint, not, I spoke about a dream, but there's a dream, but beyond that, very pragmatic actions to try to help and then connect that and say, how can we do that? And the other thing, and I said that during my just opening speech, is also break the silos and work with other industries of the public sector. Not on a very isolated way, because otherwise we won't win. Everybody can bring something to that, and then there's a community of people trying to improve together. So that's why it's okay. You can say that's just work, but we are trying to implement that every day today. I would have said 30 years ago that was not at all the same. We were very far from that. Now that's a new world, and we try to improve that for our own sake, and also to bring things to us, to bring advantage to the society. So I'm quite optimistic, despite that's a huge work and a huge risk. Fine. But I'm quite optimistic that working together will bring a lot of value to the people on the earth.
It's maybe a good note to open it up to the audience, if anyone has some question they'd like to ask. Yes, sir? Is there someone with a microphone? Marie in the front here.
From Willis Towers Watson, we're insurance and reinsurance brokers, amongst a lot of other stuff as well. Just to back up, I would agree with what Philippe said. Very often insurance is seen as a final end, the end point, the thing you do at the end. It's very important, I think, for us as insurers to understand what the risks are, to get in at the start. So insurance can be not only a financial mechanism, but also an incentive and a behaviour driver. But to do that, we have to fully understand the city. Each city is different. Each city has different risks. Each city has different political imperatives. Each city has different social issues. And all those things have to be addressed. But, here comes something Deborah said. Some things are common to cities. So all cities have issues once an event occurs, as Esteban mentioned, about clearing stuff away, emergency response, getting the system back running quickly. We work with AXA, actually, on a number of schemes at the governmental level in Africa, in the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Is there any way in which we can think about doing something on the city level in the same way, to try and provide cities that collaboratively get together, understand their common issues, and then perhaps find some kind of pooling mechanism to help them respond more effectively to the natural disaster when it occurs?
Esteban, do you want to say something to that?
Thank you. Yes. Again. No, it's true. What we always say in the program is that each city is like a fingerprint. You have a completely different kind of of context and cities, but some commonalities as well. Services are one of the commonalities. All of them need water, all of them need to the supply and chain, and all of them need connections and telecommunications and all that. And that's the part that we can basically focus on. I think that's what we call the stresses, the internalities, and that we can work on. The externalities and the shocks, we can do some mapping, and I think that the flooding models are the most difficult to anything can change in that kind of models. But going to your question, I think that that's the reason why we are working more and more with cities rather than with nations or with countries. And the reason is because you can find many commonalities among cities that live in different countries. We organize some events in Central America and the Caribbean, and actually we invited 27 municipalities from 9 different countries, and they have much more commonalities than the countries themselves, and that's important. We have to start contextualizing, and perhaps we can learn and we can have some more kind of collaboration between city to city rather than country to city. In my own country, we have a completely different context. If you go to the border with Brazil, I'm from Bolivia, so the border with Brazil is very much as Amazons, Brazilian Amazons. The border with Peru is very much altiplano. The people, the context, the climate, everything is different. So basically, you cannot apply the same kind of model to, and the challenges are different, and the reactions are going to be different because the idiosyncrasy of the people are different. The cultural way of acting is different as well. So it's not, I would say, it's a complex issue. Not complicated, but complex. And I think that we have to, we have to tackle that. And if we agree that the best or the first line of response is at the local city level, that's where we should try to provide capacity and resources. Somebody was saying, a vision, talking about dreams, a vision without resources, is just an hallucination. You need to have, you need to put your bets on something at some point. And if we identify that as really that cities are the future and are the ones which are growing, is very important. One more thing, the migration as well. In Europe itself, if you see the refugees, when you have these deals, nation deals or country deals, let's say Germany, the president of Germany says, yes, we are going to accept, I don't know how many, 300,000. 1 million refugees. The point is that they don't arrive to Germany nation, they arrive to cities. So if you don't discuss these issues with the cities and make sure that the cities are prepared to receive, this 1 million may go to only one city and destroy the whole capacity of that city. So that's important. These kind of things we have to start thinking and we have to start discussing. It's not as easy as just announcing that, I don't know, Spain will receive 2 million refugees. We have to think, where are they going to settle? And most likely they will be settling in coastal areas because, if they come from fishermen, towns and all that, they will come to these areas. Are they prepared to respond to that? Are they prepared to absorb this influx of migration? I don't know. We have to start thinking about that.
Germany is actually an interesting example. I reported on the refugees in Germany, and actually they have a formula down to the 4th decimal place. It allocates exactly how many people, but that's Germany. That's Germany. back there. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't see. Okay, you first.
Hi. Thank you for your introduction. Diana Mangalaju, University of Oxford, UK. And I would have two questions, one for Philippe Dellieux and then one for Joe. So first for Philippe, you mentioned cascading risk in your intervention, and I would like to know what do you see as the role of insurance companies such as AXA, in tackling or developing cascading risk or systemic risk, or because they are obviously related, or new forms of risk, the emerging, the slow developing risks, and so on. And not only in terms of risk assessments and risk management, but in terms of risk governance. What's the role of a company like yours?
Should I start? Yeah. Thanks. How are you? I'm trapped. First, it's absolutely difficult, of course, to embrace all type of risks, and we are certainly not specialists, and that's why we use specialists to speak about the evolution of population, migration, and things of this kind. So and even if we have specialists, you listen and you see that, well, difficult to predict. So on things like natural catastrophes, we have a little more experience. That's not only about risk assessment or risk analysis, because once we've done that, we can then advise and say, well, on this case, depending on the city, because it's very, very uneven, but on this case, what could be the best measure to take? The first one, because also you've got to choose your battles. The city cannot embrace all the things, the budget is limited and so on, but say, on that, you will gain a lot if you do that. Please, do it. So, we are close to that, or even when we speak with our so-called customers, which are not yet cities, but citizens or companies, we do that already. We advise. So, why don't we do that for cities? I mean, we are very close to that. When we analyze a risk which is just in a big factory, which is just inside the city, and we advise the factory about that, why don't we do that for the city? Well, we can do it. So we are very open to do it on that type. On the risk, we think that we know a little about. The second thing is that what is making the difference between, for example, other type of people, pure consulting firms, is that we have the experience about what has happened, the claims. So we know exactly what has happened. There was a flood there, and we know how people have been hurt, exactly. So that's not anymore a model, that's a reality. And so we can give that back and say, well, that's what we have started to give, data back to our customers, say, you are living there, this is what has happened where you live. Or this is what could happen where you live. So this is a trend we have started.
Thank you.
A lot to improve yet.
And if I may, I have a second question with you for Joe. Well, in the levers and the examples you took, both in the informal settlements and the collaborative forms, and the second point, which was more governance between municipal and traditional systems, both in the end, they ended up on the governance dimension, because they say, well, what we need is on one side alternative forms of governance, and the other side, again, new forms. And this is what we see again and again. We work in cities in developing countries a lot, like Shanghai, Jakarta, Istanbul, etc., but also in developed country cities. And everybody say, yeah, it's about governance, and you need more experimenting and learning, and etc. But in the end, what we see going, it's much more. We do more modeling, we do a bit of participation, we do a bit of assessment, lip service to this and that, but that kind of always gets sidetracked and mentioned, but more mentioned than basically operationalized. So from your practical experience, what would be your take on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think because you're raising an important issue, which is around I think it's a combination of that. What we see a lot of is attempts to remodel, to recollect data, often things that have been done before. And more and more, I think because the situation is becoming quite urgent, the message is you've got a lot of information. Take the information you have and try to use it in the best way and move more quickly, which we're not very good at as local government. So I think all of that has a place. I think data, I think modeling, I think all of that has a place. In some cases, though, I think it's almost the easier part. It's almost the easier part of the response, and we default back to it, often even when we've done that work, because it's actually easier. And the governance side is a lot more difficult. We're doing some very interesting work with developers, big developers in the north of Durban, around trying to facilitate the economic growth that's needed, but not at the cost of our environment. And at the heart of it is governance. It's around getting those people, getting all of us, local government and big developers around the table, very, very uncomfortable. The first few meetings, not very pleasant. But those are the spaces where we have to be, is taking what we know and then translating it into those really tricky governance spaces, pulling people into rooms, grappling with the issues, getting over those differences and finding interesting ways forward. And what we're seeing is it takes quite a while, but there are spaces for innovation. So I hope that's sort of responding to your query. I think there's a place for both. I think that the foundational pieces are absolutely essential. But I think we've got to watch out for defaulting back to those, because sometimes they are easier and the governance piece is often missing. And that's where it's really about people and how we bring people together and in all the ways that other panelists have already spoken to.
We have time for one last question.
Thank you very much. My name is Helen Tuxpees. I'm a researcher in Utrecht on finance for nature-based solutions in urban areas. And my question is on the role of the insurance, also as a financier perhaps, of infrastructural investment. So I'm not really into, I don't know whether insurers do this at all, but I can imagine that in the long term there's a strong rationale also for large insurers to invest directly into prevention or even opening up markets in certain cities, because then this whole region becomes insurable again. So, and that could be more kind of a direct motive, but it could also be from a more indirect perspective, because insurers also have a lot of funds that they're investing simply because they have it, right? I was wondering whether there are also thoughts on whether or not to invest that perhaps more towards infrastructural development as opposed to just broad diversification. So I would be really interested in, Philip, whether you've had thoughts within AXA on kind of also taking up that role, or maybe not, but just...
Not an easy question. I will try to answer, however. The first thing was for our group to divest on things which are against the evolution of, against ecology, like divest on coal industry or things of this kind. Then invest on infrastructure creates an issue if this infrastructure, there is no, I would say, profitable move at some point in time in the infrastructure. What does it bring to us? Because what we invest is the money of our our customers, not our money. So we need a yield for that. Let's be very pragmatic. Investing in infrastructure must belong to a specific plan. There may be some fund which has to be created on purely infrastructure, but it has to be created and find the right business model, if I may say so. I'm not sure, to my knowledge, and that's just my knowledge, maybe I'm wrong, that we have reached this situation today for infrastructure, pure infrastructures. But yes, we could play this role provided that we have found the right business plan for that. What we can do, and it's more complex, is of course that a partner, I have some partnership with people who are infrastructure providers, like my friends of Suez today here, who are here, and say, what do we do together with the city? Because they do manage the infrastructure themselves. Investing as such, then, once again, I'm sorry to say it, but the regulator will come and say, well, why do you invest for a zero yield? or where is the yield? Build up the plan, show us what you do. But that doesn't mean that I close the door on that personally. Well, we need to dig in on that, let's say.
Well, you're not going to build sea walls around Miami, are you?
Neither between Mexico and...
Okay, thank you. All right, I think we can give our panel a round of applause.
Thank you all. I think we could go on at least for 1 more hour, but we have to conclude this plenary session. And so for that, I leave the floor to Favours, CEO of the AXA Research Fund.
Thank you, and I'll be very brief. I think that when at AXA we say that we want to empower people to live a better life, when we say that innovation is a key driver of the company, the AXA Research Fund is a very concrete proof of this. What I hope you have realized today, and especially on a topic of such relevance as the resilient cities, is that to live better we will need science. To innovate we will need science. And science holds the key to a better future for each and every one of us. And in a world where scientific facts are sometimes questioned, we think it's very important to put back academic, scientific knowledge at the center of the game. Thank you very much for attending today. I hope you liked it. I'm going to give a few thank you again to our speakers. Jade Harris, who had to leave, who's host the AXA Research Fund in this department. Philippe Derieux, Robert Kunzing, Deborah Bell, Esteban Leon, and Joe Dawes. I would like a big round of applause for them. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming from various places and rather remote. We truly appreciate and you bring a lot to us. Thank you for that. I would like to give a warm, very warm thank you to Noélanie and also Marie Destremo, Noélanie Menet and Marie Destremo, who were the mastermind of today's organization. So everything that you heard today and all the research that we have funded which are related to resilient cities will be subject to a first edition of a guide which will be called the AXA Research Guide and which will consolidate various insights on the topic of today. So stay tuned, it will be released in February and we hope you like it. It's our first of hopefully a series of many. Before we move to the lunch in the room next door, I would like also to remind you that you have the opportunity from 1:30 to interact directly with our speakers and with our AXA colleagues on the topic. These will be informal discussions and I really encourage you to take the benefits of these moments if you didn't ask your question just now. I would like for that also to thank the moderators. So we'll have Marco Brettschneider from AXA Global PNC, Cédric Revolo from IRSTEA, Fabio Petruccelli from AXA Matrix, Juno Diarbolino, Deborah Bell, Joe Dawes, and Esteban Leon, who will be also acting this afternoon. Thank you also to you, sincerely, truly, deeply. We love these moments where science and civil society and companies reconcile. I wish you a very pleasant lunch, a very pleasant exchanges with, between each of you, and I hope we'll see you very soon. Thank you very much.